I'm Julia Olson, and I'm just grateful to be here. I want to thank everyone who's put this together, by the way. It's really nice to see, in the face of everything that's going on at HUC, the robust body of scholarship that's taken place here. And no matter what they try to do, they can't stifle intellectual pursuit, which I think is important and visible here in this community. Okay. So, female characters abound throughout the Hebrew Bible. There are 19 women in the book of Judges alone. They range from prophets and judges, to the daughters of warriors, to sex workers. Yet, despite their differing appearances, they all serve a very similar purpose: to humiliate a man. They are not developed characters, but formalized conventions, a caricature existing for a single purpose. To examine this phenomenon of character formalization and the woman as humiliator character, I will apply the theories of Maurice Bloch. Bloch is a cultural anthropologist who studies the Merina of Madagascar. From his observations, he has developed two related theories: language formalization and the subordination of women in ritual. My research for this project will employ these two related theories to analyze 4 female characters in the Book of Judges. For this presentation, I will describe Bloch's two theories individually, and then illustrate how I believe they can be intertwined to apply to the Hebrew Bible. And then I will briefly describe what the outcome of this research will be, I think. So if it sounds like we're talking a lot about Madagascar for the first 10 minutes, we will be. And it might not seem like this is biblically related, but it is. Bloch's theory of language formalization is drawn from his study of ritual oratory among the Merina of Madagascar. In ritual oratory, some syntactic forms found in everyday speech acts will be excluded, and the range of vocabulary available to the user will be limited. There will also be a fixed sequence of speech acts, and illustrations and metaphors will be drawn only from limited sources. There are stylistic rules to formalize language usage that do not exist in everyday speech. Because of these limitations, Bloch refers to political and ritual oratory as an impoverished or arthritic language. This also means that there's a limited range of responses available to the user. The possibility of contradicting a part of the exchange does not exist because the formalized speech only provides a single response. Formalized language requires a skill to use it, which is not shared with any but those who wield power. In the societies that Bloch examines for his discussion, oratory requires special training and formal teaching that is often only available to leaders, limiting education to the rightful heirs. As Bloch describes it, formalization is thus a form of power for the powerful, rather than simply a tool of coercion available to anybody. The theory of language formalization can be expanded to include the formalization of a narrative character. A character, like a formalized language, operates within a certain strict set of boundaries. While any character may appear in various literary contexts, narrative, legal, etc., the character's form and meaning cannot be modified. It consistently adheres to the same formalized parameters, even as it appears in different literary contexts. I will discuss formalized characterization later in this presentation. Bloch's theory of the subordination of women is drawn from 2 different rituals practiced among the Merina: the funeral ritual and the circumcision ritual. Okay. In the funeral ritual, or fama dihana, one of the primary goals is to return the decedent's body to their ancestral tomb. These tombs are monuments of generational continuity. Entering into a tomb as a decedent enters you into the society of ancestors. As the Merina view it, separation or division in any way is a threat to that generational continuity. So the process of returning to the ancestral tomb is the ultimate regrouping that strengthens the bond of the continuous ancestral community. When a person dies, their remains are usually interred in a single grave, not anywhere near the ancestral tomb. Typical aspects of mourning occur at this time, with overt displays of public grief, which Bloch describes as socially organized sorrow. Public mourning includes a number of practices, including even self-mutilation, although it is female mourners who bear the brunt of the mourning duties. Women are the ones who sit on the refuse heap, literally, not just a Jobin reference, literally sit on a refuse heap, disheveled and despairing, publicly exhibiting the discomfort of grief. When it comes to contact with the remains, the lion's share of it falls to women. In preparation for this first burial, women are tasked with washing the remains and everything in the house of the decedent, which is considered contaminated by death. Women are also the primary actors when it comes to throwing oneself onto the corpse. When a person is buried for the first time, individually, in a single grave, it is a time of sadness, of pollution, and of women. Human remains are considered extremely dangerous and polluting, and it is the women of the community who absorb and tend to this pollution. That's Merina women there, and they are sitting with the human remains wrapped there in their laps. The second part of the ritual is a far more joyous time. The decedent is removed from their individual burial after having fully decomposed. Disinterment requires the removal of every element of the deceased person, from the bones to the dust left behind during the process of decomposition. During the return of the remains to their ancestral land, a journey which can sometimes be quite long, music and dancing occur. The entire scene is a joyous one, seen as a time of blessing and fecundity. Because the deceased individual is regrouping with their ancestral community in their ancestral tomb, they are securing generational continuity, undoing any division that may have occurred in their lifetime via marriage or moving or anything else. If the first part of burial is about despair, this second part is about joyous unity. The body is carried on the shoulders of women. Once the group arrives at the tomb, the atmosphere takes a bacchanalian turn, during which the women bearing the remains throw the corpses into the air, quote, very often crunching them up, as the bones are very brittle and will ultimately disintegrate into dust from the decayed flesh. This specific and perhaps brutal treatment of the human remains is understood to dissolve the individual set of remains into a dust better able to blend with the dust of the ancestors already in the tomb, creating the indivisible community to which all Merina strive to return. Bloch views this as an undoing of the individual into a togetherness that permits the remains to become one with the community. The shaking and tossing of the remains removes the physical elements of individuality, like bones and dry flesh, and turn them into the dust, which can easily blend with the dust of others and become an eternal tomb community. While the women shake the remains and toss them in the air, they dance forward toward the tomb, and the men push them forward, literally driving them in this flurry of activity. Women represent division. They are associated with birth and the individual dwelling of the home. If unity is key to communal longevity and ancestral community, individuating acts like birth and individual dwellings are counter to unifying acts like death and communal tombs. Women aid in the transition between individual death in the individual grave and communal longevity in the tomb. By their subjugation and resulting pollution from human remains, they assist the entire community in vanquishing division and achieving unity. In their role as individual birthing agents, they humiliate men by the capacity to generate life. Thus, the men subjugate the women in the ritual that is key to reunifying the community and removing the individual barriers believed to result from female birth. To complete a decedent's birth into the ancestral community, that is their death and interment into the tomb, which that's one of those monumental tombs over there, the men force the women to pollute themselves, seemingly humiliating them in return for their original act of humiliation, the capacity for birth. The circumcision ritual highlights the same dualities of life and death, men and women, community and individuation, indivision and division, as the funerary ritual does. Similarly, women are responsible for division and pollute themselves with dirt on their heads during the circumcision, while the men greet the newly circumcised child as a member of the community and no longer simply an individual. Women are responsible for biological birth, but they are also responsible for bearing the markers of death and division. In this way, both the famadihana and the circumcision ritual devalue women and their generative capacity by diminishing the importance of biological fertility and emphasizing instead true fertility, which comes from the community at large rather than the individual. The funerary and circumcision rituals assert that both of these events are similarly a birth into community, and this is done by creating an antithesis to that birth, which is acted out by women. The victor The victory over the feminine ultimately benefits women as members of the unified community, but that unity comes at their own sacrifice. This, according to Bloch, is not unique to the Merina. In fact, quote, nearly all cultures symbolically associate women with uncontrolled biological processes. This particularly close association is used to rationalize female subordination. Women are often envisioned as a threat to the social order, powerful in their generativity, and a dangerous force that must be mitigated and reintroduced in a more acceptable package. The Merina rituals of famadihana and circumcision illustrate this, but Bloch shows that it exists throughout the entire world. Consider the ritual of baptism and its goal of introducing a child into a new family by essentially undoing biological birth and creating in its place a spiritual one. Feminine generativity is made to fit into an already existing power structure, which privileges community, including and often featuring men, rather than the individual female actor. Women bear the burden of ensuring community longevity by denying their own agency in creating it. Their formalized character convention exists to deny the singular power of female fertility and assert instead the value of bilateral community participation. The impact of Bloch's two intertwined theories comes to a head here. The ritual language is illogical, arthritic, and inflexible, thus unable to be denied. The ritual requires women to devalue themselves for the sake of the community. The community cannot achieve longevity without women's denial of their own power in creating the very members of the community. Women's own devaluation of themselves in the language of the ritual sustains the power structure that insists that devaluation is essential to generational continuity. The role played by women in both rituals is unchanging. Though they appear to be different on the surface, the end that their participation in the plot achieves is the same. They exist to deny their own power. We'll get to the Hebrew Bible. Bloch's theory of language formalization applies to oratory, certainly, but we can also use it to examine the Hebrew Bible if we consider the biblical material as one of Bloch's ritual speech communities. This relies on the premise that we cannot assume that the Bible is ordinary language. This is where we get controversial. It is because of this separation from ordinary language that formalization is so effective. It cannot be used for the individual. It is only located in the ideologically unifying realm of ritual oratory. The language of the Hebrew Bible is not the language of the people. It is not colloquial. Any interpretation of biblical literature, a psalm, a prophetic passage, a narrative section from Genesis cannot be thought of as the typical use of the colloquial language, but rather something highly curated to a particular goal, the maintenance of social control, and highly limited in its ability to communicate new ideas or be contradicted by a hearer or reader. Using Bloch's treatment of formalized oratory in the above section, it will prove fruitful to consider the scribes of the Hebrew Bible as the traditional authority and the text as the form of ritual language. And I'm using traditional authority in the Weberian sense. Max Weber. Okay. Arguably, almost no ancient example of writing can be considered representative of a local spoken language. Even epigraphic and economic materials stick to a formalized style that is not altered regardless of author. Letters and inscriptions may hint at a possible vernacular if the register of epigraphic communication matches that of ordinary language use. Since we can't be sure of that, it's not useful to compare those brief samples with biblical prose. This is supported by the arguments of Davies, Rosetko, and Young, who argue that Biblical Hebrew is a heavily formalized language that does not reflect the vernacular speech of the time. The biblical text itself is as highly formalized as Bloch's ritual language. It follows that the context in which biblical ritual language is used can be examined using the same criteria Bloch uses to analyze the context of Merina ritual. That is, given that it is already established that the language of the Bible employs all the trappings of Bloch's ritual language, it should follow that one can examine the larger use of the language within its particular context as a ritual itself. Maurice Bloch applied what he knew of ritual language to examine ritual practices of the Merina. It is possible to do the same thing with the Hebrew Bible. In terms of biblical analysis, Bloch's language formalization can here be expanded to character formalization. Seemingly unique, powerful female characters who appear to be serving different plot functions are ultimately reduced to the same conventional character type. In this way, we can extend Bloch's language formalization to the biblical author's character formalization. Their purpose is to humiliate a male character. If we examine the language of the Hebrew Bible as Bloch examines ritual oratory, we can see the means by which the authors subordinate women, even unconsciously, by repeatedly placing them in this particular character role. The character of woman as humiliator is a frozen form, arthritic and unable to be challenged. It is important here to note that the use of ritual language in this analysis does not apply to ritual versus narratival genre in the Hebrew Bible. So we're not talking about ritual text versus narrative text. It's not about formalized characters and ritual formalized characters. The ritual application comes when we understand the relationship between Bloch's ritual oratory and formalized language of the Hebrew Bible. But the characters themselves do not have to be related to ritual. Bloch's ritual language framework simply permits us to recognize the extreme level of formalization that's taking place in the literature. The subordination comes into play when we examine the use of female characters in the text. While they appear multifaceted and unique, they are underdeveloped. Flat conventions. They do not actually serve as characters, but as plot conventions, meant to move the story along and get a man from plot point A to plot point B. The formalized roles are devalued because they are not seen as characters by the authors, but as plot conventions. Their use as convention is extremely formalized, despite their superficial appearance of diversity. It's Artemisia Gentileschi. Yes. This character formalization will be examined in 3 different cases in the Book of Judges. First, the relationship between characters of Devorah, Yael, and Barak will be examined in chapter 4. The poetry of chapter 5 will be excluded from this study as it does not make use of the character formalization being discussed here. A good deal of the poetry is irrelevant to the actual story, actually. So the characters of Yiftach and his daughter will be examined in chapter 11, and the characters of Shimshon and Delilah in 13 through 16. While the female characters in each story seem vastly different, they serve a single purpose. They all have one function: to humiliate a powerful man. Barak, Yiftach, and Shimshon embody the Book of Judges' ideal of masculinity. Raw physical power, battlefield prowess, and wit are key to this picture of Judges' manhood. Yet each of these characters is humiliated by a woman. Let us consider the superficiality of the formalized character. All the women are extremely underdeveloped. The most basic information is provided about them. If they're married, that information is given, as well as where they may be located. But is Delilah a Philistine? Or is she an Israelite working with the Philistines? The authors do not find that information important. We get Yiftach's entire lineage and the interfamilial struggles he undergoes due to his mother being a concubine, yet his daughter doesn't even get a name. Devorah is a prophet who sits under a tree and judges Israel, but there's no other background information. Wife of Lapidot, sure. In a position of power, absolutely. But it's her relationship with Barak that receives the attention, not her work on its own. Yael is the wife of a Kenite who, for unknown reasons, sides with Israel. The authors are not, as Susan Ackerman and others claim, subverting a cultural stereotype by employing female characters in different positions of power. They are upholding the cultural stereotype by reducing the character to a single convention. The women are not thickly developed, they are caricatures and serve a single plot convention to humiliate a man. Based on my research so far, it's becoming clear that these female characters, and likely others across biblical literature, serve the single purpose of humiliating a man so that the authors can render a specific meaning in the plot. I believe that as this theory is developed, we will see the woman as humiliator serves to humiliate the manly men in the Book of Judges, because the Book of Judges is ultimately an anti-war satire. As society unravels more and more throughout the book, the men are humiliated on a more and more public scale. The book is a satirical book showing the follies of everything related to war, and its illustration through shaming the male characters using, that's illustrated through shaming the male characters using these formalized female characters. As the paradigm in the Book of Judges of sin, punishment, and deliverance loses structure and becomes more unhinged, The shame escalates for the male characters, culminating in Shimshon's shame in front of a stadium audience. Using Bloch's intertwined theories of language formalization and the ritual devaluation of women, we can see that from Merina ritual to the Hebrew Bible, women as actors function in a similar flat and frozen way. They serve a singular purpose to the overall message, and usually their purpose involves their own subordination. Female characters in the Book of Judges serve a single purpose: to shame a man, to challenge a particular masculinity as it relates to the status quo, and to highlight the overall plot of the story. The plot may be different. It may be a funeral ceremony or a circumcision for the Merina, and it could be a story of deliverance or seduction in the Book of Judges. But these roles cannot be challenged or changed, and they exist within the structure of the language employed for different uses, but serving always the same function. Every time you show me that, I'm like, okay, I'm almost done. These characters are formalized plot conventions, and they are devalued as actual characters instead and reduced to a mere function. Women are used as a vehicle for shame in Judges, and the shame is meant to subvert the masculinity featured in the book. By subverting the male power in the book, the authors have offered a critique of military prowess and masculinity to illustrate the futility of war. The pseudo-cyclical nature of the Book of Judges emphasizes this critique. Using Bloch's theory of language formalization and the ritual devaluation of women, I believe I can highlight this particular convention and use it to interpret a new meaning in the Book of Judges. This examination will increase the scope of feminist criticism in the Hebrew Bible by applying Bloch's concepts of formalization and devaluation to the text, drawing a clearly contoured, highly developed, formalized female character who, despite her changing appearance, continually serves the same role across all of the literature. Okay, question?
So how would you, I mean, Deborah doesn't seem to fit into that schema particularly,
How doesn't she?
or just be, what, does she humiliate Barack? Yeah.
He says,
Yeah.
he says, I can't go without you. And she says,
That's right.
fine, I'll go.
Right, that's right.
But another thing is that like, she's also like, one of the reasons Barak has to be humiliated is because he questions her prophecy, and she uses a specific verb, which I'm gonna forget now, in the prophecy that indicates that God's already with Barak, and Barak is like, he's like manifesting like the spirit of like Mari, where he wants the prophet on the battlefield to say, is this the time we go? And she said, you already go, you know? So I think like, and she's not very well developed. Oh, the number of articles I've read. Is she the woman of torches? Is she, you know, it's just, she's not developed. Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't feel like the men in Judges are super well developed either. Like they're all caricatures, like they all have these kind of like basic plot points, like they're not characters that you care about. They're nothing like the patriarchs, for example, right? Like there's no kind of feeling of like investedness in each of them as like long-term people.
Yeah, I mean, Barak's definitely not Abraham, but like, I think the male characters function as the sole actors of the story. Yes, absolutely, they're the focus of the story.
They're not characters in the way that anybody that you think in like a novel. I guess I'm wondering, what do you mean by the women are not characters? Just that they're not the focus?
Well, I think they're just a specific single character. So like they're all serving the same purpose, whereas the men in their own serve different purposes. Exactly. So I think like the women, they're presented as this idea of like, you have a diverse cast, right? Like women like do all sorts of different things in the Book of Judges. But I think that like their role often serves this same role of this like formalized female character that humiliates a man, whereas the men have the opportunity to have a little bit more information given about them generally, and they move the plot forward, right? Women just sort of like exist like for that plot convention, whereas like men in the story are generally functioning as like the main actors. Does that make sense?
On the other hand, though, the whole story is cyclical, so it's like you're not actually moving the story forward, you're just kind of moving it along.
But it's only cyclical up to a point. It starts to break down. And that's like one of the points too, that I like, ugh, if I could only condense 85 pages of writing into this, we would go after this. But I think like, so the cyclical structure of judges is definitely a part of this theory, right? That like, as you start to see the men break down, they become like less likable characters, right? Like Altniel, far more likable, though brief, than say HUC, who like makes this rash vow and is seen as like sort of this impulsive, although diplomatic sort of leader. So I think like you start to see this breakdown in like traditional masculinity, and the women are just there to like be their downfall, which is where you get that sort of like subordination of female characters as a singular point, whereas the men have like a diversity of roles. Does that make sense? I saw it back there, and then I saw a lot.
I wonder, kind of piggybacking off Abigail, if we have to say the same thing about men, insofar as if the goal of judges is to be an anti-war satire, wouldn't you just say that the buffoonery that is Samson just simply is a function and that he just serves the plot point in the same way that the women serve the plot point? Even though maybe Samson gets a little bit more description, it's hard for me to understand how they're also not just subject to the plot, to the plot.
Right, that's a good point. So I would say like, so,
Repeat for the Zoom.
oh, so how are the men also not equally like a plot point?
Flat.
Yes, flat. So very much so. I think like in serving this purpose of judges as an anti-war commentary, like you do have the reduction of all characters, but like the women, like they're like so highly predictable that like I would compare, instead of like male characters who are buffoons, which like they're all over in the Bible, I would say that the women are not female characters as much as they are like the trope of the well. The women, like, you know, meeting at the well, that's where you're gonna find, that women are not a character, they're the well, right? Does that make sense? Like they're like even less
So
than
in
even
Judges-
the buffoonery.
So in Judges, the male characters are flat, but it's not as flat as the women.
Yes.
Yeah, male characters are flat, but the women are background.
Yeah, they're not
Yeah,
even characters, they're
yeah.
plot convention.
Yeah.
Like the well, they're, yeah, and we have Evan and then Lev. Oh my goodness. Right, take it away, gentlemen.
So I know that you're using the Madagascar examples because of, that's what Bloch talks about. But in your research, I don't know if you include this in a more extended version. Do you pull from any either ancient Near Eastern, or maybe if you're going with Davies, a Persian or Hellenistic period example that's closer to the time of biblical production that you might show other female characters being used this way, like support your perspective? Or
I mean, as of right now. But I think like, I mean, that could be valuable, but the idea is that like specifically you're looking at a community of authors, the biblical authors, who are employing a plot convention that subordinates female characters. And like, that's like maybe unique to that ideological community. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
Does that make sense? You don't have to humor me if it doesn't. You can help me.
I am, yeah, I wonder if there are like Persian examples or ancient Eastern examples that might be like, see, other people are doing this too. But even without those, I think the evidence is already strong enough on its own. But
worried that it wasn't.
Yeah, so just one thing is, when you hear the word satire, there's kind of that assumption that everyone involved is a caricature. And so, again, as we got to eventually in the Q&A about how the men are caricatures, but the women are even less than caricatures. And I think, when you start with, oh, the men are full characters, then you say, oh, but it's a satire, that causes that bit of dissonance. So in the main discussion, you were saying, here's how the men are caricatures, here are the women are even less than caricatures.
Right. Okay, that's a good point.
I
Yeah.
did agree with you.
Yeah.
The other thing I
like-
definitely agreed with you on was how the language of the Bible is not is that formal, ritualized kind of communication that wasn't vernacular. I mean, that's true of American English now, that you have ritualized, structured language of academia, of politics, that requires special learning, and those who get the special learning can use that to wield authority, and it's difficult for people who don't have that to engage and counter it. So I think that's very evident.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like you and I were talking about lunch, it's just Foucault all over.
Yeah.
Who are we excluding from the discourse because we create the discourse?
Yeah.